Brittany knocked on her neighbour's door. Brooke opened it and stared at her classmate in surprise. "Do you have anything to eat?" asked Brittany as she entered the room. "Yes, come in," Brooke offered. They sat at the table, which served as both a lunch and writing table, and Brittany began to eat pasta, telling Brooke about her unsuccessful date. Brittany was a beautiful girl, and there were always guys who wanted to meet her and spend time with her. However, Brittany dreamed of fancy restaurants, expensive cars, and a romantic marriage proposal. Lately, she started to meet men online, going on dates almost every evening, but no one was suitable for her. Even today, she had dated a miser who took her to a cheap diner, from which she ran away as soon as she realized that there was nothing more to expect. The day before yesterday, on the contrary, a rich and generous man had come to the date, but by the end of the evening he concluded that he and Brittany were not suitable for each other. Imagine, he dragged me to a Chinese porcelain exhibition. We walked and looked at vases and plates. He told me something about emperors of the dinosaur era and other nonsense. Boring. Then he took me to the cinema, to some art house. Why am I so unlucky with men, huh? Don't worry, you'll find someone else, Brooke said uncertainly. Brittany sighed and went to sleep in her room. She had to go to college the next day. The professor looked at Brittany hostilely, as if she were to blame for his own unattractiveness, weight, and probable loneliness. "You have serious problems with your academic performance. Very serious," he said. "I'm trying my best." Brittany made honest eyes and nodded frequently in confirmation of her words. "I, personally, don't see that you're trying. You're skipping lectures. You probably have more important things to do than studying." He got up with difficulty and approached the girl almost closely. His eyes slid over her face and settled lower on the neckline of her blouse. "Maybe we can come up with something." Brittany exhaled, feverishly thinking about what to do. The prospect of being expelled did not please her. Studying seemed to be the only way to catch on in the city and somehow arrange her life, especially since she did not know what to tell her parents. And soon it would be summer. She was supposed to go home to the village and talk about her academic achievements, but she had none. "You could, for example, start attending lectures," the professor suggested, shrugging. "But I'm afraid in your case it's already pointless. I'll have to bring up the issue of your expulsion." "Can't we come to some kind of agreement?" Brittany asked flirtatiously, leaning forward slightly and showing off her cleavage to the professor. She knew her worth: beautiful, tall, modern, and moderately uninhibited. She had long suspected that the old professor had his eye on her, and judging by his reaction, she was right. "May I invite you somewhere?" the professor asked, blushing. "I agree, and completely trust your taste," Brittany breathed out, smiling encouragingly. That was enough to make the man bloom. He bowed his head, revealing his shiny bald head surrounded by rare hair, and kissed her hand. Neither Brittany nor the professor suspected that two students were standing outside the door, greedily eavesdropping on their conversation. When Brittany left the classroom, they quickly moved away from the door and went straight to the rector's office. There, they spoke with the vice-rector, who happened to be the wife of the amorous professor. In the evening, Brittany and the professor went to a restaurant and then to his house. The man was sure that his wife wouldn't be home for at least another 3 hours, but unexpectedly the door to the bedroom opened and his wife appeared in the doorway. There was a scandal, shouting and tears. The professor, looking confused, ran around the room picking up his clothes. Brittany sat on the big bed and watched this scene in horror. The wife looked at her husband with hatred and pity. "We've been together for 30 years. Our children have grown up. You already have 2 grandchildren, and you still continue to cheat on me," she said bitterly. "Do I need to remind you who you owe everything you have now to?" She waved her hand in despair and looked at Brittany angrily. "And you're expelled." The verdict was announced. 2 weeks passed. Brittany had been shaking on an old bus for 2 hours now. Her neighbour, a perky elderly woman, had been telling the village news the whole time. Brittany looked out the window. She already regretted accepting her friend's offer to spend the summer at her country house. But it was impossible to go home. She couldn't imagine how she would face her parents. So she called and lied, saying that she had passed her exams successfully and decided to stay in the city for the holidays. And now, on the bus, she was wondering if she had done the right thing. But what other options did she have? Renting an apartment in the city was expensive, while the house in the village was free. The bus turned off the road and stopped. An elderly lady pulled some baskets into the aisle, then turned to Brittany and said, "My relative Anthony should be here to meet you. You're new here, so we can give you a ride." Brittany got off the bus, took out her fashionable suitcase and looked around. People were dispersing in different directions, and the elderly woman was already hurrying towards an old pickup truck. Anthony seemed very attractive to Brittany. He was around 40 years old, tall with neatly combed light hair and grey eyes. "So, Auntie, did you visit your grandchildren?" he asked, opening the trunk. "Of course," the elderly woman replied playfully. "I saw my grandchildren and the city." "That's good." The man nodded approvingly and looked at the pretty stranger with chestnut curls and green eyes. "Hello, who are you going to visit in that backwoods?" "I came to your area to rest," Brittany replied thoughtfully. "Well, there's nothing to see here," Anthony laughed. His laughter was infectious. Brittany smiled. "I am quite satisfied with the river, fresh air. The nature here is beautiful." The man agreed. When he learned that Brittany was going to live in the Blakes' old house, he was very surprised. The house had long been uninhabitable. Brittany shrugged helplessly. "Well, I'll manage somehow," she said uncertainly. "I was told there are tools in the barn." Anthony shook his head, loaded her suitcase into the trunk, then opened the back door. "Get in. We'll figure out the house somehow." Chloe kneaded dough with a smile, stealing glances at her quiet children who were building something with Legos on the floor, frowning in concentration. Although Chloe couldn't give birth, she loved her children like they were her own. She and her husband had adopted the boy and the girl from an orphanage when they were 5 and 3 years old, respectively. Before that, they had tried everything to have their own child, from seeing doctors to visiting shamans and psychics, but to no avail. They gave up hope and even considered divorce, with Chloe suggesting that her husband leave her so as not to ruin the life of a healthy man who wanted a family. But he stayed, reasoning that if it wasn't meant to be, they would live together no matter what. And then the idea of adoption was born. Chloe baked a pie and meticulously cleaned the house. Despite being a city girl and the daughter of wealthy parents, she was very house-proud. They had moved to the countryside 3 years ago, and in that time, Chloe fully adapted to rural life. She learned to bake pies, milk goats, feed chickens, and more. without which one simply cannot survive in the village. Suddenly the dog barked happily. Anthony had finally arrived. A minute later, her husband appeared in the house. He hung up his jacket, walked up to the mirror, and scrutinized his reflection. Chloe was surprised. Anthony had never paid much attention to his appearance before. "You're a bit late," she said, looking at the clock. "It's already 7:30. "Well, a girl from the city came here," Anthony shrugged. "Henry Blake's granddaughter rented her out the house for the summer. I gave her and my auntie a lift from the bus stop and helped a little," he replied without looking at his wife. "No one's lived in the house for a while. Even the windows were boarded up." "She came alone, didn't she?" Chloe asked, wiping her hands with a towel. "Yes, she's a student," Anthony answered indifferently. "That's strange," Chloe shrugged. "Well, let's eat. Sit down." Anthony quickly washed his hands and sat down at the table. He threw the towel aside and breathed in the aroma of freshly baked cabbage pie. "You're so skilled a hostess," he said, hugging his wife with pleasure. The next day, Anthony came to help Brittany again. He fixed the table and stool and hung a hammock in the yard. "I don't know how to thank you," Brittany said playfully. "We, the villagers, are simple. Thanks is enough," said Anthony. "But you don't seem like a villager," replied Brittany. Anthony laughed and sat on a repaired stool. "You're right. I moved here from the city with my wife and children." Brittany tried her best to hide her disappointment at the news that her interlocutor was married. "It would be interesting to hear how you ended up here," she said. Anthony shrugged. "I used to come here every summer to my grandmother. Once, an expensive car drove up to our neighbour's house and a woman, a man, and a little girl got out. They went inside the house. Then the local boys approached me and said, 'Hey, this is our street. Get out of here.' I grabbed a stone and said, 'If you don't leave me alone, you'll get it.' And I threw the stone at them. I wanted only to scare them, but I hit the car. The glass shattered. The boys ran away immediately, and I stood there in shock like a statue. Then the door of the house opened, and the same girl came out. She looked at the car and asked, 'Did you break it?' I nodded. Then her father came out of the house, looked at me, looked at the car, and started yelling. But the girl turned to him and calmly said that she accidentally broke it. She said a big dog was running around. She got scared and threw a stone. Her father looked at her affectionately, patted her on the head, apologized to me, and went back into the house. I started courting of that girl. I left wild flowers under her gate every day. One day I even caught fish in the river and left it on their threshold. Her father, I remember, threw away the fish and scolded, 'What kind of joke is that in the village?' And then I decided to write her a love letter. I put it in the mailbox. Her mother took the letter out, but didn't tear it up, and gave it to her daughter." "How romantic!" Brittany clapped her hands. "And then?" "Then I got many bad grades in school and didn't come back to the village anymore. I stayed at home and studied during the summer. Later I came to my grandmother's house again, but I didn't see the girl anymore. Years passed. I joined the army, and in the second year of service, I received a letter from my mother that my grandmother had died. At the funeral, a beautiful girl approached me. I looked at her, and it was the same girl. She had grown up, become more beautiful. In short, I fell in love again, but this time seriously. I had 1 day left before I returned to the army, and I spent it with her. We talked, sat by the river, remembered our childhood, the fish and the broken car, and my love letter. Anyway, she said she would wait for me to finish my service." "And did she?" Brittany gasped. "Yes, I finished my service, we got married, and then we adopted children and moved here. Oh, really? You adopted kids? You're a saint, exclaimed Brittany. Anthony smiled shyly. Oh, come on. I just always wanted children, and she... He hesitated. Brittany nodded understandingly. That's personal, I understand everything. Anthony left with a strange feeling of shame and awkwardness. He was ashamed that he unintentionally compared this charming guest to his wife, and awkward because the comparison was not in his wife's favour. Brittany was lost in thought, sitting in her bedroom in the evening. The fact that the handsome Anthony was married and had 2 children was somewhat upsetting. As she was putting on her pyjamas, she caught some movement out of the corner of her eye. Who's there? Come out and show yourself. There were sounds of rustling, then silence. Brittany felt uneasy. 10 minutes later, Brittany was trying to fix a hole in the fence when Anthony caught her at this activity. What are you doing? He asked in surprise. I'm repairing the fence, Brittany answered a little irritably. Can you help? Anthony walked into the yard and agreed to help with fixing the fence. Brittany briefly recounted what had happened, and Anthony laughed, good-natured. Your neighbour, old Tom, hasn't been interested in anything like that for a long time. He's beyond suspicion. Brittany protested, insisting that she had heard someone rustling around. Anthony walked up to the fence and leaned into the gap, beckoning Brittany over with his hand. Do you see him? That's who was rustling, he said, pointing to a dog. Brittany laughed, realizing her mistake. Anthony decided to nail up the gaps anyway for Brittany's peace of mind. She was grateful, and 5 minutes later Anthony was already hammering away, attaching pine slats to the largest gaps. He felt Brittany's gaze on his back and compared her to his wife once again, and once again, not in his wife's favour. Meanwhile, his friend Jack was looking for him. And where is Anthony? Jack asked as he entered the house. At work. Where else would he be? Chloe replied, surprised, as she set aside her knitting needles and yarn. Don't you work together? Why all the questions? Jack scratched his balding head, looking puzzled. He's not there. I've been looking for him all day. I need permission to get the parts, but I can't reach him. Jack said his goodbyes, hopped on his motorcycle and leisurely drove down the street, turning his head, searching for the familiar blue pickup. Soon he spotted the car parked at the gate of an old uninhabitable house. But the house no longer looked abandoned. The windows were open, women's clothes hung on a line in the yard, and the door was ajar. Jack got off his motorcycle and knocked on the door. Voices and hurried footsteps could be heard inside the house. Anthony opened the door looking peculiar, dishevelled, shirtless, and with his belt undone. In general, everything became clear without words. Jack was Anthony's friend, but as an exemplary family man he did not welcome such frivolity. I need to sign some papers, Jack said, flustered. I'm going to get the parts. I've been looking for you all over the workshop, and I couldn't reach you. Do you have the papers with you? Anthony asked irritably. Jack pulled out a folder from his backpack and handed it to Anthony. Without looking, Anthony signed the papers with a flourish. What are you doing here? Jack asked. None of your business. Anthony sternly looked at his friends. You didn't see anything. Got it? Jack nodded uncertainly. Anthony reached out his hand and squeezed it tightly, looking meaningfully into his eyes. Just don't ask about anything, okay? I haven't figured out how it happened yet. Jack had no intention of asking about anything. He felt sorry for Chloe and her 2 young children. He also felt disappointed in his friend, and that hurt the most. Days went by, and Anthony's behaviour became increasingly strange with each passing day. He came home late, ate quickly and silently, answered all questions monosyllabically or with standard phrases. Chloe couldn't shake a nasty, unexplained feeling and imagined the worst scenarios. She wanted to believe Anthony, but it only got worse. Chloe didn't even notice when Susan, Jack's wife, and her friend came into the house. Susan was working at the library. She was very well read and proudly considered herself part of the village's intellectual elite. "Hi," she cheerfully greeted Chloe. "You look like you're going to the conference. What are you thinking about?" "About trust. How do you think? If a man loves, he'll deceive?" Chloe answered a question with a question. Love is often elevated to some absurd level in books, but even love is not a panacea for deceit. It's a well-known fact that people lie. Those who are honest towards some people can be very calculating and cunning towards others. Such is the paradox, my friend. Someone deceives under pressure of circumstances, someone for a mere ego boost, and someone simply cannot imagine their existence without lies. But not trusting anyone means being in constant stress, looking for hidden meanings everywhere, exhausting oneself and others with doubts. You cannot to love, but if you don't trust, why bother starting a relationship at all? Susan expounded. Chloe sighed. Susan's musing added to her confusion. Perhaps she needed to act simply, talk to her husband heart to heart, and then see what would happen. However, the conversation did not take place. It so happened that Chloe found out about her husband's infidelity, seeing everything with her own eyes. After talking a little more with her friend, Chloe saw her off, and looking at the clock again, dialed her husband's number. He was unavailable again. Without thinking for long, she left the house and walked down the street. People were walking towards her, some from the farm, some from the sawmill, and some from the machine shop. Chloe saw Jack. "Hi, do you know where Anthony is?" she asked him. "How would I know?" Jack became nervous and looked away. "Am I his supervisor?" "Don't be so foggy," Chloe questioned. "I can see that you're hiding something." "I'm tired. I'm going home." Jack turned away quickly and hurried down the street. Chloe watched him for a long time and went towards the river, where the Blakes' house was located. Approaching, she saw her husband's car at the beginning of the twilight and the light in the house. No longer hoping to see anything good, she looked into the windows. Her husband was embracing and kissing a young stranger who was practically without clothes. Chloe felt as if someone was choking her, but she managed to control herself, opened the door and entered the house. Seeing her, Anthony froze, and Chloe looked at him disdainfully and left the house. The woman practically ran down the street, trying with all her might not to cry. The sound of an engine was heard behind her. "Chloe, wait! Listen!" Anthony leaned out of the car window. He looked pitiful. His hair was dishevelled and his eyes were frightened. "Wait! Let me explain!" Chloe stopped, turned to him and crossed her arms over her chest. "Explain?" She squinted. "Well, try to explain." "I don't even know how it happened," he mumbled. "I lost my mind, made a mistake. It happens. Please forgive me." Chloe really wanted to hit him. She probably would have done it if there weren't people on the road who threw curious glances at them. "Let's talk at home," she said shortly and walked down the road. Anthony slowly followed. "Get in the car," he asked. "It looks strange. I'm driving, you're walking. Think about what people will say." "Is that all you care about?" Chloe replied bitterly. They covered the entire path home the same way. She was on foot, he was driving. At home, Chloe sat on the sofa and then quietly cried. She didn't throw stools at him or smash plates, but these quiet tears of his wife were more frightening to him than any screams and scandals. "Let's forget about this," he asked again. "Do you want me to go to her right now and tell her that there's nothing between us? Do you want that? I love only you." "Yes, I want. I want you to pack your things and leave." She sobbed. "I'm not interested in where you go, to her or anyone else." "I won't pack anything," he frowned. "Then I'll help you," Chloe shrugged, opened the closet door, and within 5 minutes, Anthony's suitcase was filled with his clothes. "Take your things and leave," she said firmly. Anthony walked out of the house with his head down. He drove to the end of the street, stopped at Jack's house and honked. His friend came out immediately as if waiting. He looked at the suitcase on the back seat and sighed sympathetically. "She kicked you out?" Anthony nodded and pulled out cigarettes, handing one to his friend. They smoked in silence. "Well, I was thinking," Anthony finally said. "Starting tomorrow, I'm going on vacation. You stay for me. I'll go to the sea with Brittany. She's never been there before and I need to rest." "Get a grip," Jack protested. "Your family is falling apart and you're going to resorts with your mistress. What's wrong with you?" "It's none of your business. You better keep an eye on things here while I'm gone." Anthony threw away the cigarette, started the car, and drove to Brittany. Jack shook his head and walked home, inwardly shuddering at his friend's actions. The next day, Anthony grabbed his mistress and took her to the sea to relax and get revenge, while his faithful wife was left alone with the 2 children. 10 days later, in the village, Jack enthusiastically hugged his brother. "Hey, bro!" He slapped Charles on the shoulders. "How long has it been since we've seen each other?" "Couple of years, probably," Charles smiled. Jack looked at his cousin's shiny car. "Cool car," he said admiringly, touching the shiny wing of the black BMW. "Thanks," Charles replied modestly. "Business is going well. I can afford it." "Good for you," Jack said, and pointed to his Ford, which had seen better days. "And I'm still on the same old horse." "Not bad either." Charles touched the worn handles. Susan clapped her hands. "Oh, men will be always men, ready to talk about cars only. Charles, come in. We don't promise museums and restaurants here, of course, but we guarantee good fishing and a warm welcome." The men obediently entered the house while Susan quickly set the table. Out of courtesy, she sat with the men for half an hour before heading to her friend's house to discuss her husband's brother, whom she believed to be a very worthy man. At Chloe's, Susan sat in the kitchen and vividly described the guest, sharing everything she had learned from him and from her husband. "He's a good person, but unlucky in his personal life," she said in the end. "Unlucky?" Chloe asked indifferently. Despite Susan's efforts, the suitor's candidacy failed to impress Chloe. She listened half-heartedly. Her thoughts were elsewhere. "When he shared his last love, I felt so sorry for him. Although with his money, he could buy anyone." "You can't buy love," Chloe sighed. "That's true too," Susan agreed with a sigh. "Do you want to meet him?" Chloe laughed. "What's so funny?" Susan didn't understand. Even if I wanted to, how can I compete with the city beauties? Besides, I have 2 children. But he said he always dreamed of a normal family, but fell in love with this Helen, who turned out to be a cuckoo. She left her own child with her mother and went to the capital to build her own personal life. Yes, it's a pity, of course, sincerely sympathized Chloe. Chloe had changed a lot over the last few days, as if years had passed. Outwardly, she remained just as attractive, but the spark of someone interested in life had disappeared from her eyes. She kept the house clean, the children were well groomed and fed. She did not forget about herself either. She did not get ungroomed, and did not gain extra pounds. She did not eat sweets to her resentment. She understood she was responsible for her 2 young children, who were certainly not to blame that their foster father had betrayed them and decided to go out on the side. Initially she waited for Anthony to return, and was even ready to forgive him on the condition that the mistress would leave, and he would forget her forever. But Anthony didn't come back, and it turned out that he was now at the seaside with his mistress. So Chloe waved off persistent invitations from her friend, saying, "I'm not up for new acquaintances right now." Meanwhile, Charles and Jack were riding a motorcycle through the streets, laughing. The villagers looked at them with either a smile or disapproval. "Charles, where are you going?" Jack yelled, pointing forward. Charles turned the handlebars, but it was too late. The front wheels sank into the brownish-green slush. The motorcycle tipped over, and both of them fell to the puddle. "Where did you learn to drive?" Jack shouted. "It was my first time on a motorcycle," Charles excused himself. "What's going on here?" a stern female voice asked. The men turned and saw Susan standing with her hands on her hips, glaring at them. "Darling, don't be mad. We were just taking a little ride." "I see you're drunk," his wife retorted. "Just a little bit," replied Jack. Charles remained silent. He wasn't looking at Susan, but rather the woman standing behind her, graceful, thin, with a tired look in her brown eyes. Susan turned to her, said reproachfully, "Meet Chloe. This is Charles, the brother of my alcoholic. And apparently he's an alcoholic too." "Hello." Charles stood up and shook off his expensive jeans. "You'll excuse us. We've been making some noise. Just haven't seen my brother for a long time." Chloe smiled sadly and pulled out a handkerchief, applying it to his forehead. "You're hurt. Come inside, I'll treat your wound." Jack smiled and showed his scraped elbow. "I'm hurt too. I need treatment too." "I'll treat you in such a way at home that you'll remember it for life. Come on, get your bike and let's get home," Susan promised her husband, pretending to be angry. Charles and Chloe watched as the roaring motorcycle carried the couple up the street. "Come on." Chloe opened the gate. In the house, she took out gauze and peroxide, quickly treating the scrape. The entire time, Charles watched her silently, seeming to admire her. "You have such soft hands," he noted. Chloe blushed. Susan was right. This Charles was undoubtedly attractive, and he did have a sad look in his eyes. "They're just hands," she answered impassively, putting a band-aid on the wound. "There, all done." "Thank you." He touched the thick strip on his forehead. "Do you live alone?" "With my children. They're at a friend's house right now." "And your husband?" "I don't have a husband." She paused. "I don't have a husband anymore." "Did you get divorced?" Chloe looked into his eyes intently. Charles, it's time for you to go. I have a lot to do. Charles nodded in agreement. Yes, sorry for the inappropriate questions. I was just curious. Thank you for treating my wound. Later that evening, Charles asked Jack to tell him about Chloe. In general, Anthony went to the sea with his mistress. Jack finished his story. Charles shook his head. Oh, and I asked her about her husband. What a fool I am, he said regretfully. Don't worry, you didn't know, his cousin reassured him. So, did you like her? Charles nodded. Listen, but there's one important thing, Jack reluctantly said. She has 2 adopted children. I don't see any problem. And that's wonderful, Charles thoughtfully replied. Another plus for her. If she has adopted kids, that means she has a kind heart. Jack glanced at his wife, who only smiled at the corners of her mouth. The next morning, Charles woke up early and went to the nearest town. He bought a gorgeous bouquet of red roses, Belgian chocolates, and French champagne. An hour later, Charles was already standing at Chloe's door, politely knocking. 2 children came out of the house and stared at the guest curiously. Who are you? Me? Charles winked and handed them a box of candies. I'm here for your mother. Is she home? The children grabbed the box and ran into the house. A few seconds later, Chloe appeared in the doorway. Seeing the guest, she involuntarily adjusted her hair and pulled down her long skirt. Hello, Chloe. Charles politely bowed his head. I hope you're not too busy. Are you here for something? She asked. Charles shrugged. I'm just here for you. Meanwhile, Anthony quickly realized that something was wrong with his new passion. As soon as they settled into the hotel, Brittany, a frivolous beauty, turned into a disgusting shrew right before his eyes. She behaved as if she were a lady that everyone owed something to. She grumpily argued with the administration because she did not get a room with a sea view, although Anthony had paid for a room without a sea view. She demonstratively pulled the curtains and constantly nagged Anthony that he could have found better vacation conditions. Then Brittany complained about the noise allegedly coming from the broken air conditioner in the room. She started walking around the neighbouring rooms to check how loud it was for them. The guests complained about the rude neighbour, and the administration asked her to stop these antics. Instead of relaxing and enjoying herself, she decided to fight to the end and complained to the administrator about the cynical and unprofessional treatment she received. She screamed at the maids, complained that they were rude to her, contemptuously called the beach a dirty dump and the sea a stinky puddle. In addition, she poisoned herself with something in the hotel restaurant and spent 2 days in the room hugging the toilet. But on Anthony's advice to visit a doctor, she disdainfully replied to that she trusted local doctors even less than local chefs. Anthony couldn't help but feel like he was going crazy watching all of this. And for this woman, he traded his Chloe. He already knew that this was their first and last vacation together. Anthony was tired of feeling embarrassed by his companion, so he abruptly set a condition that either she calmly rests and is content with what she has, or he leaves. After these words, Brittany was offended and left the hotel. Anthony searched for her all night throughout the city and eventually found her drunk at a roadside cafe in the company of drunken men. Upon demanding that she go with him to the hotel, she brazenly smiled and sent him away. When the conversation became heated, her companions intervened. Anthony returned to the hotel alone. He gathered his things and went to the airport. His mood was terrible. He regretted meeting Brittany and cursed her for being so frivolous and himself for giving in to weakness. Now he had one task: to beg for forgiveness from his wife. He had no doubt that he would succeed. After landing, Anthony left the airport building, took the truck from the parking lot and drove home. Passing through a small town, Anthony belatedly remembered that it would be more convenient to ask for forgiveness with gifts. But he was so angry with Brittany that he didn't even think of getting presents for his wife and children. Therefore, he went into the first store he found and bought the most expensive champagne and the most expensive box of chocolates. The seller was surprised and put the box and bottle in front of him. "Strange, you're the second one buying this today," she said. "And who was the first?" Anthony asked, paying. "I don't know. A handsome man in a black BMW with out-of-state plates." Approaching the house, Anthony saw a black BMW parked in front of it. Stopping next to it, he got out of the car and looked at the sparkling crossover. "Strange," he muttered and pushed the gate, holding the champagne and chocolates to his chest. Upon entering the yard, he immediately heard his wife's ringing laughter and the rolling laughter of an unfamiliar man. Anthony stood in bewilderment, then still went into the house. The guest was sitting at the kitchen table drinking tea. Opposite him was Chloe. At the sight of the person entering, both of them stopped smiling. "How should I interpret this?" he growled, looking straight at his wife, and sat down on a chair, making it clear who the master of the house was. "I don't have to answer to you," she answered calmly. "Do you think you have the right to ask me such questions after everything you've done?" Anthony had nothing to say to this argument, so he frowned and stared fiercely at the guest. Charles looked unperturbed. "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" Anthony snarled. "Do you know she's my wife?" "I've never seen you before," Charles replied mockingly. "How should I know?" The atmosphere in the house was tense. Chloe stood up from her chair and positioned herself between the two men. "You see, very soon I will no longer be your wife," she calmly addressed her husband. "We are getting a divorce. I hope you won't object." "I am objecting. We'll see about that." Anthony shouted menacingly and threw champagne and candies on the floor. Chloe narrowed her eyes. "Was it me who took a mistress and ran off with her to the seas?" "And you're glad that I have done so?" snarled Anthony. "Now I am," Chloe shouted, "very happy, and it would be nice if you just left now." Charles felt uncomfortable. He wasn't afraid of Anthony's sudden return. He just felt awkward being a witness to a family scene. "Anthony, can I talk to you?" he said. "Let's go outside and talk like men." Anthony responded with such a selection of curses that Chloe had to push him out of the house. Spewing curses, he sat in the car and drove off. Charles looked seriously at Chloe. "Are you serious about divorcing him?" "Absolutely, Charles," she answered quietly and looked at him in surprise. "I'm glad." He approached her, took her hand, which smelled of lavender soap, and kissed it. The woman was embarrassed and quickly withdrew her hand. "Charles, you've only known me for a short time." "I've met many women, and I always thought I was in love, but then I saw you and realized that there was no love there. I was wrong, confusing this feeling with passion, infatuation, anything. And now I met you and realized that I love you. Later, when he left, Chloe was washing the dishes with a smile, reminiscing about her childhood in the village, where her parents took her almost every summer. She remembered how she secretly watched a boy who used to leave flowers under the gate and then ran away without looking back. She remembered the letter in which the boy confessed his love to her. Chloe turned off the water, quickly wiped her hands and went to her bedroom. Digging through her old things, she pulled out a yellowed envelope, read the almost forgotten lines, pressed the letter to her chest, and burst into tears. Honestly, she still missed Anthony very much, but he betrayed her, so she would try to forget about him. Such things are unforgivable. And Charles, it seemed to her that he was sincere in his feelings. After all, sometimes people fall in love at first sight. As for her feelings, time will tell. 3 months later, an ordinary-looking family strolled along the main street of the capital. A father, mother, and 2 children. The kids gazed around in wonder as if everything around them was a fairy tale. Charles and Chloe smiled as they watched them and kept silent, not because they had nothing to say to each other, but because they found it pleasant to walk side by side and be silent. How about trying the status of a married woman again? Charles finally broke the silence. I haven't recovered from the divorce yet, Chloe replied with a smile. I still hear the curses ringing in my ears. Anthony was not going to give up without a fight. He came back again and again, begged, pleaded, threatened, and even tried to blackmail her with the children. The more he came back, the more he began to annoy her. The woman saw neither pride nor repentance in his behaviour. By then, Charles had returned to his city and regularly called to Chloe before coming to the village again and having a serious talk with Anthony. No, he didn't threaten him. He simply offered a large sum of money. Anthony was first offended, then pondered, and then became even more audacious and demanded that they give him the house in exchange for agreeing to the divorce. Charles suggested it to Chloe to move in with him in his big apartment in the city and give the house to her husband. She agreed, especially since there was nothing left for her in the village. After the deal, Anthony and Chloe quickly divorced. The woman knew nothing about the fate of his mistress. Anthony simply said they had broken up. One day, Mrs. Blake, the owner of the house where Brittany had been staying, came to visit. She said that Brittany had returned to her native village and got a job at a poultry farm. None of her bright plans came to fruition. No marriage, no education, no money. Now Chloe is trying to come to terms with the fact that she has been living with a mercenary man who was not only unfaithful, but also vile. She didn't want to hear anything more about him, and for the first time in a long time, she thanked fate that the children were adopted. Forget about him. You left the house. Let him live as he wants, and you're here with me, and the children too, said Charles. She nodded and smiled, and the autumn sky smiled too. A second ago, gloomy and unfriendly, the sun peeked out from behind leaden clouds, reflected off the wet cobblestones, played in the windows with golden flashes, ran across the reliefs of the buildings, and illuminated the square. Chloe suddenly felt bright and happy. The clouds disappeared in her soul too, and the long-awaited sun looked out.